Welcome, dear listeners. I am Grimwick, your guide through a world of imagined secrets and half-remembered tales. The stories you are about to hear spring from my imagination, though at times they may brush against real souls and fragments of history. Each diary holds 50 entries, revealed one by one, like pages turning in candlelight. Miss not a single chapter, and keep close to the little bell that calls whenever a new entry awakens. And if you whisper in the comments whose diary you long to uncover, well, perhaps that very volume already rests in the shadows of my collection. So then, my companions, let us begin.
Harvard Inn, Coney Island, 1917 to 1919. Frankie Yale liked his floors shiny and his men shinier. Like everything in the Harvard Inn was a reflection of something bigger, something that mattered more than what you could see on the surface. The place wasn't Harvard University. Hell, it wasn't any kind of college you'd find in a book. But the lessons were strict as any professor ever taught, and the tuition was paid in bruises, respect, and the kind of education that stuck to your bones. The Harvard Inn sat on Seaside Avenue like a jewel in a crown made of sawdust and broken dreams, all polished brass and mahogany that gleamed under electric lights bright enough to make midnight look like noon. From the outside, it looked respectable enough, the kind of place where working men could spend their wages on entertainment that didn't come with sermons attached. From the inside, you learned that respectable was just another word for careful. Keep the door light, meaning easy to pass through for the right kind of customer. The kind who brought money and left troubles outside on the sidewalk. Keep the till heavier, meaning every transaction mattered. Every nickel counted, every dollar earned was a dollar that bought another day of independence from men who thought they could tell you how to run your business. And keep the customers believing they're the important part of the picture, even when everybody with sense knew that customers were just the audience for a show that never really ended, never took intermission, never ran out of acts. "Remember, kid," Frankie would tell me, adjusting his tie like he was getting ready to conduct an orchestra. "They come here to forget they're nobodies. Our job is to let them remember they're somebodies, long enough to spend what they got in their pockets. When you break a jaw, do it clean. No mess on the linen tablecloths that cost more than most men made in a week. No blood on the carpet that somebody's mother would have to scrub out come morning." Violence was a tool, Frankie taught me, like a hammer or a saw. Use it right, and it built something. Use it wrong, and it just made noise. When you throw a man out, let him keep his hat. Let him keep his dignity, too, if he was smart enough to hold on to it during the disagreement. Dignity is cheap to give, and costs nothing to preserve, but it buys you a lot. Keeps a man from coming back with friends, keeps him from nursing grudges that grow teeth, keeps him telling stories that make you sound reasonable instead of stories that make you sound like an animal. A man who loses his money can earn it back, Frankie explained, watching me escort a drunk stevedore toward the door with the kind of gentle firmness that kept furniture from getting broken. A man who loses his pride, that's different. That's the kind of loss that comes back to haunt you. I learned the business of faces at that door, standing in the space between the street and the sanctuary, between the law and the lawless, between the world that pretended to be respectable and the world that admitted what it really was. Faces told stories faster than mouths ever could, and reading them right meant the difference between a quiet night and a night that ended with broken glass and newspaper headlines. Who's going to tip? You could see it in the way a man held his shoulders, the way he looked at his money when he counted it. The way he treated the coat check girl and the cigarette vendor. Generosity wasn't about having money. It was about understanding that money was a tool for making people remember you fondly. Who's going to argue? That showed in the eyes, in the way a man scanned the room like he was looking for something to prove, someone to impress, some slight that needed answering. Arguments were like fires, easier to prevent than to put out once they got started. Who's going to reach under his jacket for pride he couldn't afford? That was the most important read of all, because pride was the most expensive thing a man could carry into a place like the Harvard Inn. Pride made men do stupid things, dangerous things, things that turned pleasant evenings into front-page tragedies. A doorman is a judge without a bench. His courtroom is the threshold, and his sentence is momentum. You turn a body a few inches, guide it toward fresh air and clearer thinking, and the night is better for everyone involved. Sometimes the verdict was welcome, sometimes it was not tonight, and sometimes it was never again. But the judgment was always swift, always final, and always delivered with the kind of courtesy that made it feel like hospitality instead of enforcement. Frankie Yale had a smile that told you he'd already counted your teeth, not because he was planning to rearrange them, but because he was the kind of man who counted everything. Teeth, dollars, heartbeats, the number of seconds it took for a situation to turn from conversation to confrontation. He ran the block like a maestro conducting a symphony, never raising the baton higher than necessary, always getting the exact note he wanted from every instrument in his orchestra. He taught me that cash isn't the only payment that matters in this business. There's the interest you charge in fear, the kind of tax men pay for the privilege of walking away from situations they started but couldn't finish. There's the discount you give for respect, the consideration you show to men who understand the rules and follow them without needing reminders carved into their memory with fists or blades. Money's temporary, Frankie would say, counting the night's take while I swept up cigarette butts and broken dreams.
Fear lasts longer. Respect lasts longest. You want to build something that outlasts you. You build it on the foundation that don't crumble when the weather changes. He also taught me how quickly a favor becomes a chain, how helping a man out of trouble could turn you into the solution for all his future problems, how gratitude had a way of transforming into expectation when you weren't paying attention. A favor given was a debt owed, and debts had a way of accumulating interest that nobody talked about when the original transaction was made. You help a man once, you're a good neighbor, Frankie explained, teaching me the arithmetic of assistance. You help him twice, you're a friend. You help him 3 times, you're his business partner whether you wanted to be or not. As for the scar, people act like it's a story written by God, like divine judgment carved into my face for sins I'd committed or was planning to commit. Truth is, it was written by me, by a mouth that moved too quick on a night when the music was too loud and the whiskey was flowing too free, and I thought I was funnier than I actually was. The girl was beautiful, Maria Galluccio, dark hair and eyes that caught light like pieces of coal catching fire. She was standing near the bar with her brother Frank, laughing at something her girlfriend had whispered in her ear. And I made the kind of crack that 17-year-old boys make when they want to impress men who've forgotten what 17 feels like. "Look at the ass on that one," I said, loud enough for the wrong ears to hear, stupid enough to think charm and crudeness were the same thing. I'd like to take a bite out of that. Frank Galluccio heard every word, and his answer came written in steel. 3 quick lessons carved into my left cheek before I had time to apologize, to explain, to take back words that were already traveling through the air like bullets you couldn't call back to the gun. The mirror in the Harvard Inn's men's room showed me a new face when I finally got the bleeding stopped. A face that would make strangers work harder to read my intentions, make them wonder what kind of man I was, and what kind of mistakes I'd already made. The scar didn't change my temper. That was still Brooklyn short, still ready to flare up faster than a match in dry kindling. but it changed my timing. It taught me to let silence arrive first at every conversation, to let other men fill the quiet with words that revealed more than they intended. I learned to withdraw a grin before it cost me more than I could afford to pay, to smile only when smiling served a purpose beyond my own amusement. The scar became my signature before I knew I needed one, the mark that would follow me into newspapers and police files, and the kind of legend that grows larger than the man who inspired it. People would see it and think they knew my story, knew what kind of violence I was capable of, knew how far I was willing to go to settle disagreements.
Sometimes that knowledge worked for me, sometimes against me, but it always worked faster than words. But there were good nights, too. Nights when the Harvard Inn felt less like a battlefield and more like a ballroom, when the music taught my feet another language and the laughter sounded genuine instead of desperate. The orchestra would play waltzes and foxtrots that made even gangsters remember they'd once been boys who danced with their mothers in kitchens that smelled like Sunday sauce. The smell of ocean wind would push through perfume and beer and tobacco smoke, reminding everybody that Coney Island was still connected to something larger and cleaner than the small corruptions we practiced for a living. Women would laugh like the world was finally being polite to them. Like for a few hours they could forget about factory jobs and tenement apartments and husbands who drank their paychecks. I carried that music west in my coat when I finally left, packed it away like a photograph of better times, something to remember when the business got ugly and the choices got hard, and I needed to recall why I'd ever thought this life was worth living. Those were the nights that made the violence seem worthwhile, that justified the fear and the respect and the careful calculations of power and territory. Those were the nights when the Harvard Inn felt like what it was trying to be, a place where working people could spend their money on happiness, even if the happiness was temporary, and the money was hard-earned, and the people who provided the service weren't entirely respectable. If Brooklyn hammered me into a shape, rough, angular, useful for the kind of work that required strength more than subtlety, then the Harvard Inn put a polish on it. Not the kind of polish you could buy at a store, but the kind you earned from seeing every sort of man at his most honest moment. Drunk and celebrating, sober and confessing, jealous and dangerous, generous and foolish. You understand a city better when it's holding a glass in its hand, when the whiskey has stripped away the pretenses, and the beer has dissolved the careful lies people tell themselves about who they are and what they want. Alcohol was like truth serum for an entire population. And working the door at the Harvard Inn was like having a front row seat for a show about human nature that never stopped running. It showed you where the money slept, in the pockets of men who worked hard and spent harder, who saved nothing because they'd learned that tomorrow might not come, and today was all they could count on. It showed you where money woke up, in the hands of men who understood that entertainment was an industry, that happiness was a commodity, that people would pay premium prices for the illusion of luxury and the feeling of importance. The Harvard Inn taught me that crime wasn't just about breaking laws. It was about understanding desires that the law couldn't satisfy, about providing services that respectable society pretended not to need. It was about reading the gap between what people said they wanted and what they actually paid for when nobody was watching. When the train ticket finally winked from my pocket, Johnny Torrio's invitation to Chicago, to bigger opportunities and more dangerous responsibilities, I took one last look at the door I'd been guarding for 2 years. The brass nameplate that read Harvard Inn still gleamed like a promise, still suggested education and respectability to people who wanted to believe that's what they were buying along with their drinks. I wasn't leaving a job when I walked away from that door for the last time. I was graduating. With honors nobody would hang on a wall, with a diploma written in scar tissue and signed in other men's blood, with an education that would serve me well in cities where violence was a language everybody spoke, but only a few men spoke fluently.
The train to Chicago was leaving in an hour, carrying me toward a future that would make the Harvard Inn look like a children's birthday party. But I'd learned what I needed to learn standing in that doorway, reading faces and managing threats, and understanding that respect was something you earned one careful decision at a time. I'd learned that power wasn't about being the strongest man in the room. It was about being the one who decided when strength was necessary and when it wasn't. I'd learned that reputation was currency, that fear was interest, and that sometimes the most important lesson you could teach was knowing when not to teach it at all. The Harvard Inn had been my graduate school, and now it was time to find out what kind of career my education had prepared me for.
I trust you enjoyed this glimpse into a most curious diary. If so, leave behind a small token of your delight with a like, and do consider joining our circle by subscribing. And remember, ring the little bell, and you shall be the very first to know when another diary or a fresh entry emerges from the shadows. And if a whisper stirs in your mind, a thought, a riddle, perhaps a name of someone whose secrets you would dare to uncover, leave it for me below. I read them one by one. And who knows, your wish may guide my hand to the very next diary I choose from my collection.